Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Archives of American Art's Unboxed Lunch. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this is being recorded. I also want to gratefully acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the indigenous territory of Piscataway and Nacosdoc or Anacostan peoples, as well as recognize the diverse Native communities who make their home here today. My name is Nora, and we're thrilled you're joining us for lunch, which I'm enjoying here in Washington, D.C., and my colleague, the Archives Gilbert and Kinney New York collector, Jacob Proctor, is joining us from our Manhattan office. Today's event is all about the papers of photorealist painter Howard Kanovitz, which Jacob will be exploring for the first time with all of you in a few minutes. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. At any time during the webinar, you can submit your questions for Jacob, which I will read to him as he uncovers materials from the collection. To submit a question, just type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat function as well. I'd like now to introduce Jacob Proctor, Gilbert and Kinney New York collector at the Archives of American Art.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you all for joining us for lunch. This is see if I'm going to adjust my view a little bit. Okay. So yeah, this is really an introduction to the papers of Howard Kanovitz, who was an American painter, as Nora said, who kind of became most well known as one of the very earliest I think Barbara Rose called him the godfather of photorealism. But I know that there's also, he didn't necessarily see himself as a quote unquote photorealist, but that's sort of how he's been remembered most commonly in history. I should say that this is a collection that I wasn't particularly, I knew only peripherally about this artist, and actually my predecessor in this position, Annette Leddy, had gone out to Long Island to look at these papers a few years ago, and then it took a while for them to be sort of put in order. And so when they arrived, luckily I had Annette's notes, but it's also been an interesting education for me. Because as I started going through them, and essentially what you see behind me is all I've really done so far is taken the papers and the files and everything out of the cardboard shipping boxes in which they arrived, and I've rehoused them in archival storage boxes. And in the process of doing that, of course, I started looking through them a little bit. And so what I've done is just pulled out a few little bits and pieces of that I found interesting right off the bat. And I realized that although Kanovitz himself wasn't very familiar to me, as I started looking through, I realized that many of his friends and colleagues and associates were. So it's an interesting, these papers are open onto a great context, which is always something that's interesting with archives, is the ways that figures who might not be the most famous often have amazing materials that can shed light on a whole era. And so this is a great example of that, I think. Some of the real strengths of these papers, just most immediately, and I'm going to be sharing these with you, are correspondence, photographs, and preparatory materials. There also are there's business correspondence and checklists and kind of more mundane things, but these all jumped out very much at me right away as being especially interesting. So, like, for example, right here, I'm holding up to the camera a handwritten letter. I hope this is focusing, I can't quite tell. From the composer Morton Feldman, who was a good friend of Kanovitz's, and it's postmarked June 1954. So there are two letters from Feldman in this folder. There's also some great correspondence from Larry Rivers, who was a very close friend of Kanovitz. I'm holding up another handwritten letter, which is, Rivers's writing is quite large. This goes on for many, many pages. Also from the 1950s. And this was actually mailed, you can see it was mailed to the artist in France. So in the mid 1950s, he took a couple of years, I believe, and lived in Europe and traveled around Europe and North Africa. And he spent at least some of that time traveling with Gregory Corso, the poet. This is a photo of the two of them, I believe, in Nice in 1954. And there's also a great airmail letter from Corso to Kanovitz that this photo is tucked into. There's some other nice photos of the two of them on vacation. This is a particularly nice one. This is either 54 or 56. I'm not quite sure. Again, this is going to be all work for future researchers to really figure out. And so it's interesting that Kanovitz was a painter, and he grew up in Massachusetts in Fall River, and was originally, I think, set out, from what I can gather, to be a jazz musician, and then sort of became an artist along the way, and attended RISD briefly in the Art Students League, and ended up in New York in the 50s, and ended up as Franz Klein's assistant. And so in the 50s, he was very much in the ABEX scene, this kind of downtown ABEX scene. His painting of the time fits very much into that visual language, and as did his kind of social scene. This is a great photo here. I think hopefully it's focusing. This says on the back that it's probably summer 1954, and it's a softball game, and we have Franz Klein catching. Willem de Kooning is at bat. Franz Klein is standing is the umpire, and Howard Kanovitz is catching. So this is at this is out on Long Island in the summer. So you can, that gives a little bit of a sense of the context in which he was circulating in the 50s.
I wanted to add really quickly, Jacob, that I know that we have some acquaintances of Howard's on the webinar. So if you all know some of the details that researchers are going to find out more thoroughly, you can totally drop them in the chat or the Q&A. That's fun. We can share that with everyone as well.
Yeah, it's great. This is again, this is all knowledge is a benefit here. And so I mentioned that he was good. So here's a photo from, I think this is from the early to mid 60s, the kind of classic New York artist bar situation. And here he is. He and Larry Rivers were lifelong friends and played in a lot of bands together, and released at least one album that's included in the collection here. And here they are. It says mid 1960s. Kanovitz and Larry Rivers. Larry Rivers playing saxophone, Howard Kanovitz on trombone, performing at the 5 Spot here in New York. So there's a lot of this good stuff. Here's another photo of him in his studio in this, I believe this is 1963. If you can see this, he looks very much the part of the sort of New York artist sitting in his paint-spattered studio, of course, smoking a cigarette, wearing a suit. This was, I always love these studio portraits of artists around this time. That one then became the cover illustration for an invitation to an exhibition of works dating from 53 to 63. So that's why I'm assuming that the photo was taken in 63. Also, because actually one thing that you can see is that you can see that there are some representational paintings in the studio here. And, you know, I started talking about he was an Abex painter, but in 63, it seems, he had a bit of an aha moment and began painting figures. And he ran with it. And by 1966, he had a solo show of these paintings at the Jewish Museum here in New York, curated by Sam Hunter. And of course, this is the same year at the Jewish Museum that Primary Structures was mounted quite famously. And here's a picture of Kanovitz, and I'm not sure who the other person is actually, in that show in 66. And so this he kind of rocketed to prominence in this kind of moment of new realist painting.
I wanted to just chat, maybe this person knows who the other person is. There's someone named Jane is in the audience who says that she knew him as a babysitter in Provincetown and Long Island from 1972 to 1975, which is really fun. Maybe you saw, Jane, some of those scenes similar to the sports backyard scene we just saw. If you remember anything else or want to share anything else, you can totally enter that into the chat or the Q&A. Thanks for that.
There's actually a great photo here of speaking of Provincetown. I don't know, this is maybe a hard one to see on camera, but it's what it is it's like a physical taped mock-up for that became a poster for an event from the Provincetown Art Association. Free concert, music slides, film, bring your own color slides or photos, which will be included in the performance. And it lists all the participants, including Kanovitz, Kinney, Rivers, music from Terry Riley, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. So good, nice little avant-garde festival in Provincetown. Not sure, so this is 1970. So there are a few things like that. We actually, with the poster that it became is also in the collection, but it's not in the best condition, so I don't really want to unfold it at the moment. So there's just a little bit more biography might be useful. You know, sort of Kanovitz was included in, he was selected by Harald Zeeman, famous Swiss curator, to be included in Documenta 5 in 1972 in a section of sort of photo-based and realist painting where he was included among the other artists, people like Chuck Close and Robert Bechtel, but also Germans like Gerhard Richter, and I think Sigmar Polke, Franz Gertsch. So there's that early and very sort of important exposure in Europe meant that from quite early on, he had a lot of traction in German-speaking Europe in particular. So his work is actually included in a lot of German museums, and he was collected quite early and seemingly somewhat extensively by Peter Ludwig, whose collection became the Ludwig Museum in Cologne, and as well as the MUMAC, the Museum of Modern Art in Vienna. And so it's interesting to see, especially having lived and worked in Germany myself, the way that that he has a career that is almost like an expat artist even though he didn't actually live in Germany. And so here, for example, is a photograph from 1979 of Kanovitz at the opening of a retrospective that was organized first at the Akademie der Kunst in Berlin, and then it traveled to the Kastner Gesellschaft in Hanover. And he's here with the German critic Ursula Bode. So this is there's a lot of correspondence with German and Swiss galleries. He had a lot of success in West Germany. So that's also interesting, kind of interesting window onto the kind of European American, how would I say, sort of dialogue or conversation at the time.
Jacob, there's a question here about our collecting, how we collect, how we choose what we collect, and what types of papers and collections are in our holdings.
Well, we choose, there are a lot of different criteria, but for individual artist papers, obviously this prominence and significance of the artist themselves is one factor. But on the other hand, you can't always tell, as I was saying earlier, that, the sort of, often it's the artists who are not the most famous names who actually have some of the most interesting papers. And so in this case, if I had been the one to visit, I would have started going through this and seen what depth there is in terms of the correspondence and the photo documentation, not just of the work itself, but of a whole kind of artistic community. And so in this case, that is what really jumped out at me first. And then as I started looking into the papers and researching, doing a little bit of kind of more research about the artist himself, I realized that this is someone who actually was incredibly prominent at the time, and for whatever reason has become less so over the years. And I'm not a specialist, and I'm certainly not a Kanovitz specialist, but there are a lot of reasons why people, some people come to prominence and other people sort of drop out of the record. But our job at the archives is to kind of collect and preserve the fullest picture that we can of the art world in the United States.
And that's all part of our collections plan as well. We have a formal collections plan that is aligned and so guides our work.
Yeah, and we, again, each type of our collections plan includes different criteria for different categories of papers. So institutional records, the papers of historians and critics and writers, artists, there are a lot of different ways of looking at that significance.
I have a couple of fun comments here from folks who knew Howard. Jane said that he didn't like living in Germany. It was related at a dinner party in 1975. That's good to know. And then there is a comment from Denise who said she knew Howie most of his life. That's how folks are referring to him. So, and she met Gregory Corso at Howie's wedding and worked for them in Provincetown in 1963. So that's fun details too from folks. And there's someone else. This is from Brian. I worked at the Alex Rosenberg Gallery in the mid-1980s and helped Howard hang one of his shows there. I was stunned one day to get a call that former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt was in town and was coming to see the show that day. That afternoon, Schmidt arrived with an entourage of US and German security. He spent 20 minutes quietly viewing the show, thanked us all, and left. Howard, always extremely private about his personal life, never mentioned how he knew Schmidt at all, although I assumed he had met him sometime when he was in Germany.
How funny. Well, these are all great anecdotes. So what else can I say? There's other correspondence. There's a letter. I'm not going to take it out of its sleeve because it's very fragile, but this is a really nice letter from Frank O'Hara to Kanovitz. They were also good friends. And there are a few letters from O'Hara, and I believe that they're in the published in the collected the volume of O'Hara's collected letters and correspondence, if people want to look them up. There's also a lot of really great preparatory material. I can show you a little bit of sort of the working process, I think. So I mentioned that this photo, he started painting from photographs, and this is I just printed this off because for some reason I haven't come across a photograph of this painting, but it's called New Yorker's One, and it's in the Whitney's collection. So I just printed this from the Whitney's website, but which was based on this news photograph of sort of Richard Rogers and his kind of atelier or studio. And this was this was a very new thing to be painting directly from photographs. But then pretty quickly he switched from using like straight images from the media and started really making collages. And so he would start photographing people individually. For example, here's a photo of Larry Rivers. And let's see, here's B.H. Friedman, the author and critic, author of, among other things, very early Jackson Pollock biography. Here's Morton Feldman. And these were all, here's, who else did we got here? These were all used as, here's Alex Katz. And it really was a bit of a boys' club. Someone mentioned that, I saw this go by in the comments. And that's absolutely true. It's very much a boys' club. And kind of made a second painting called New Yorkers 2, where he essentially assembled, I'm sorry this is so glossy, it's a little bit reflective. He essentially assembled all of these individual photographs into one kind of coherent visual space. And this would become a kind of a method for quite a very productive method. And it was not entirely uncontroversial in that this painting, which is called The Opening, which is from '67, you can see on here there's Howard Kanovitz himself talking supposedly to Barnett Newman. And Newman was so upset about this that he wrote a letter that was published in New York Magazine. Basically, he was upset because that anyone would think that this was a truthful representation of an event, when of course it's not at all, and it was not intended to be. So that's kind of interesting as well. But there's a lot of preparatory material. There are lots of news clippings and things from magazines and popular media of various kinds that then you see popping up in various configurations in the paintings, as well as photographs that were clearly staged by the artist to be used in this context as well.
It's a good time, given the scope of this collection, to ask this is a question from Carolyn, who is Howard's widow, who sent some questions before the program. And one is about how many collections do we receive about a month, or what the pace of that can look like, and how long processing takes.
The pace is really hard to predict. I've been in this position for just about a year. So I came on during the pandemic, just after everything shut down. And the pace is, it's up and down. It doesn't, I'm not sure what this statistic is, but it's, I think there are busy times and slower times.
It depends on a lot of different factors.
Right now, sadly, it's pretty busy with galleries and closing, and some of them because of COVID, some of them just coincidentally. But yeah, that's I'm not sure exactly what this statistic is, but
right.
Usually in terms of processing, we generally are able to have a folder level finding aid produced within 2 years under normal circumstances, which is fast for archives. And COVID kind of threw that all into, has kind of slowed things down on that front as well. But I'm sure that we will eventually get back to that. And the great thing about this finding aids is that it allows researchers to look on our website and know, not in fine-grained detail, but in a fairly good amount of detail, what is in the collection and what by individual folder. And then if they, which is of course great if you're planning a visit to DC to look at papers, but it also allows people to use our digitization on demand service to have individual folders digitized.
Very conveniently, our digitization on demand, a link to that was just put in the chat by my colleague. So if people want to check that out, you can check it out there.
This is a really interesting object that is it's a drawing and collage of drawings that I believe is some kind of a study for a print that was made in 1980 called Visible Difference, that actually the Smithsonian American Art Museum has a copy of, among other repositories. But it's interesting because all of these different elements are all, this book, for example, is a drawing, but it's also cut out and collaged onto this other drawing. The same is true of this beer can, and like this book, and this sort of scene from, I think it looks like Seurat's Afternoon on the Grand Jatte, or something like that. But what's really interesting, and I don't understand, maybe Carolyn knows why this is, but it's all rendered in reverse. Like all of the text is written in a mirror almost. So it's a very interesting object in that sense. And I don't know enough about his work to know why that would be, but I found it quite fascinating. It's also nice to see that one of the books in this little still life is Lucy Lepard's book on sort of change. I think it's called Changing or Changes, on the art of the 1960s and 70s. And of course, we have Lucy Lepard's papers in our collections as well.
One I want to make sure I get to Carolyn's other question also, which is, I'm going to read it. This is from Carolyn. As an ex-art history PhD student searching for a dissertation topic and later becoming an artist's widow sitting on a treasure trove of information, I've often wondered about partnerships between the archives and universities who want to share the archives as a resource.
Yeah, well, I mean, the archives have long been a sort of prime destination for art history graduate students writing dissertations. And we have a pretty exciting new initiative, or I guess it's maybe a year or two old, called that's done in collaboration with the Lindbergh Institute for American Art at Colby College and the Cleveland Museum of Art. It's a collaboration between the three organizations about teaching from primary sources. And actually our acting director is at this very moment in a Zoom session of this consortium on this topic. But people can also peruse our journal, the new, if students are looking for interesting new archives to write dissertations about, you can always look through the new acquisitions of the last few years of the journal to see what, if there are particularly interesting collections that have recently come in. So
that's, and our spring journal is officially, I think I got a notification yesterday. Yes, there it is.
On my desk right now, it just arrived.
Spring green.
Spring green, exactly.
Oh, one more question. The letters are sleeved in what right now?
Well, most of them are still in their envelopes. I like this, a couple of them, some of them were in kind of plastic sleeves. And I had tucked a couple of them into Mylar sleeves just as a sort of protective measure, because I didn't want to handle them too much, because some of them really are quite fragile. But everything will be eventually rehoused in kind of proper archival standards.
One more thing from Carolyn, and this is, I have all the original books he frequently used as images for his work. She also has books by poets with comments about Howard. Yeah. And asked if we can if things can be added to a collection once it's.
Yeah, sometimes we We of course try to get everything all at once, but yeah, there are many cases of later additions being made to collections. Sometimes that's because new material is discovered or comes to light. And other times it just has to do with, maybe an artist made a donation during their lifetime and then another edition comes in when they pass away. So yeah, Carolyn, we can talk about it offline.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jacob. Thank you everyone for coming and joining us for Unboxed Lunch. Support from friends like you in attendance makes it possible for us to share collections like Kanovitz's with curious people around the world. If you'd like to know more about making a gift to support our virtual programming, or if you would like to be recognized, if you'd like your gift to be recognized in an installment of Unboxed Lunch, you can contact me, Nora Daniels, at danielsn@si.edu. My colleague Eric dropped that into the chat a little bit earlier. Or use, it's in the chat. My email's in the chat. To support the work of our collectors and archivists, you can always visit aaa.si.edu/support. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Jacob. And I hope the weather's warming up for everyone as it is here in DC. We'll see you next time. Bye.